Hi, this is Joe again with another review. But I was saying in this video, those of you who have seen my previous video, talking about the History Channel program, History's Greatest Mysteries, we did a 3-part episode, or a three-part series about the Roswell crash, and particularly looking into this journal, which less to talk about that in this video, the better. But the most part of that video, or of that series, was a discussion of the famous or infamous Roswell crash back in 1947. And I mentioned in that video, I'm going to go into a little more detail in this one, about the Roswell crash, because it is the 75th anniversary. It's coming up this weekend, really. Even though I'm recording this video on June 30th, 2022, the actual crash actually happened on July 2nd, 1947, and was reported to almost a week later, on July 8th, 1947. That's because it took a few days for the U.S. military to come by and check it out, and then on July 8th I know I'm ahead of myself here, but July 8th is the date when they announced they had found wreckage of a crashed UFO. So in this video, to mark the 75th anniversary of the Roswell crash, that's what I'm going to be discussing in this particular video. Of course, like I said, the Roswell crash, the Roswell incident actually happened, like I said, the actual crash was on July 2nd, 1947, about 75 miles northwest of Roswell, New Mexico. And what happened was you had an electrical storm, I think it was the night before. And the next day, Mac Brazel, who was a foreman on this ranch, he goes out there to see, okay, which is the best area to water the sheep, because naturally maybe they have some water in this one particular area. And what he found was he found the wreckage of a crashed craft. If it was a UFO or not, it was still speculation 75 years later, which is hard to believe. So what Mac Brazel did, he showed some of the wreckage to a neighbor, and the neighbor suggested, oh, maybe we should report it to the police or to the Air Force base that's out here. Because the Air Force base that was there in Roswell, which is now a defunct base now, it's been an abandoned base for a few years now. I think maybe since the 1950s, and if not the 1960s, the latest. And they, maybe they investigate stuff like this, because at that time you only were hearing reports of UFOs on the radio. Of course, there was no TV yet. Not until 1948. There was no TV then. But I heard on the radio that there was like a reward, like a $3,000 reward for people who found wreckage of a UFO or have proof of UFO. By that time, they used the term flying saucers. Then at that time, so what Mac Brazel did, he reported to the sheriff, who then in turn closed up the Air Force base. So maybe this is one of those top secret jobs they have this crash out here. I said, well, the Army Air Force Base in Roswell sent out the intelligence officer, whose name was Major Jesse Marcel, Sr. He goes out there and investigates it, and he knows all types of, he had investigated all types of air disasters. Airplane crashes, helicopter crashes, all types of air vehicles. He has investigated, he can identify them like that. But in this particular case, he didn't know what the hell this thing was that crashed on this ranch. So he said, oh, it doesn't look like any material of a crash or any vehicle that I'm familiar with. So he believed there was a crashed UFO. And so, of course, when he reports this to Colonel Blatchett, who ran the Roswell base, he said at the time, he decided to put out a press release saying they have found wreckage, or they have wreckage in their possession of a crashed flying saucer. And about a few hours later, but approximately about 6 hours later, the next day, General Roger Ramey had put out, or I should say, about 6 hours later, General Roger Ramey put out a new press release that was actually a weather balloon, not a flying saucer. So, of course, at that time, in 1947, people weren't as skeptical at that time. It had to take about 20 years to the 1960s when the Vietnam War was going on, when people were becoming skeptical of the government or what the military was telling them. But at that time, just 2 years after World War II had ended, people were more accepting what the government was telling them, no matter who was in office at that time. It doesn't matter if it was a Republican president or a Democratic president, people actually believed what the government and the military was telling them. Nowadays, everybody is skeptical of what they were telling them because, politicians are all liars, no matter which side of the political aisle they're on. But in 1947, they believed everybody. And they put out an official statement, they said, this is it, and that's it. And people basically accepted it. Well, 31 years later, in 1978, Stan Freeman, who since passed away, like 2-3 years ago, he passed away, which is a shame, because I'd like to see him around now for the 75th anniversary of the Roswell crash. They'll come out with a statement about what happened. But what he said was he was investigating the UFO crash, and he was in a TV station in New Orleans doing an interview, and somebody says to him, one of the producers says to him, "Oh, why don't you talk to Jesse Marcel? He handled the wreckage of one of those UFOs you were interested in." And so he goes, "What?" And I was stunned, and he actually found Jesse Marcel, and like I said, 31 years later, was finally willing to talk and mention what happened. And of course, 2 years later, in about 1980, it was like 1980 or 81, he did an interview for the show In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy, which I referenced to in the History's Greatest Mysteries review I did. And that was really the first real television show, at least a nationally syndicated show, which In Search Of was at that time, to give an interview and talk about these UFO cover-ups. That show was on about like 7 or 8 years before Unsolved Mysteries, which we're going to get into hopefully in a minute. Hopefully soon and get into that. So what happened was, Jesse Marcel gave an interview, and that's about the only interview that I know of that Jesse Marcel has done, because I think he died like 2 years, like 1982, he passed away. But it was the only time that he actually gave an interview on a national program about what had happened in Roswell, New Mexico. He says the footage they actually posed for pictures at a news conference that Roger Ramey gave. He says that wreckage that was posed with, that was not the real wreckage that I found on the ranch. So they go like, oh, who's really telling the truth? Is Jesse Marcel telling the truth, or is the military is? And of course, after that interview, they had more people coming out, more people coming forward to tell their stories. And then, of course, like I said, 8 years later, Unsolved Mysteries came out with a story, and you can see that episode actually on YouTube. Actually, is the second season premiere. Is episode 1 of season 2. You can see the season 2 premiere episode for season 2. They did about half the episode, or approximately more than half of the episode, they did with the Roswell crash. Well, the first story was with a Vietnam vet looking for a nurse who nursed him back to health during the Vietnam War, and then the rest of the episode was with the Roswell crash. And that was really, they took over more than half the show, and it was, one of the, because Unsolved Mysteries was a very, very popular show. I previously did a review of Unsolved Mysteries on my YouTube channel, so please check it out. and that was really the first really broken. People really got into the unsolved mystery, not only unsolved mystery, but into the Roswell crash, because it was how most people got into the Roswell to check out the Roswell crash through the Unsolved Mysteries program, or at least that particular episode, because Unsolved Mysteries was known to do even by the second season. They're already known to do some UFO stories by the season. The second season premiere episode, they only did a couple of episodes of stories with UFOs, particularly the missing time episode, which I think happened in season 1. So even by that time, there were people doing, Unsolved Mysteries doing those type of stories, and people got hooked. When the UFO cover-up the U.S. military was doing, the U.S. government was doing. So about 5 years after the Unsolved Mysteries story came out, or that episode, and they also did other stories as well. They did the Kecksburg crash, they did the Venetian Forest incident, they did the Hudson Valley UFOs, they did one with Belgium as well, Belgium UFO incident. So they did a whole bunch of stories. And by 1995, I think Unsolved Mysteries by that time was ending its run on regular television, and then they went on Lifetime after that. Anyway, in 1994, the U.S. military finally decided to say, okay, we're going to come out and do an investigation. And then in 1995, and then again 2 years later, in 1997, they came out with 2 reports. One says that the Roswell incident case closed was one of them. The Roswell incident, and then the other one was case closed. The first report was that the Roswell crash was actually a downed weather balloon, codenamed Mogul. I mean, come on. I mean, the problem with that is you had Jesse Marcel, who had the telling he had top secret clearance. They didn't tell him about it. It didn't say. I mean, it was so classified that the guy who was investigating the Roswell crash, Jesse Marcel, he wasn't even told by his superiors that this was a Mogul balloon. But there are some people who came out and said, "Oh, the Roswell or the Mogul balloons didn't happen till 1953." About 6 years after this, it depends on who you believe is more credible, because it wasn't until about 1952 or 53, 5-6 years later, when it became more well known that the height of the Cold War in the early 50s, where the military was using the Mogul balloons, and then in 1997. It was more hoopla because it was the 50th anniversary of the crash in Roswell. So the U.S. military came out with a second report talking about, the dead alien bodies were found in Roswell. Well, what happened was they came out with the so-called alien bodies that was found. It was these high-tech anamorphic dummies that came out, and because they dropped them off at high altitudes to see what would happen if somebody for the space program has to eject at such a high altitude. What would the effect on the human body? And so the faces were expanded, and the body shrunk or whatever, so it looks like dummies. Meanwhile, those dummies didn't happen around the same time as the Mogul balloons in the early 1950s. I mean, supposedly, and like I said earlier. Depends on who you believe, who you think is more credible, these UFO researchers or the U.S. military. Depends on who you believe is more credible. And so that's where supposedly where the debate ends. Of course, not only did you have the Unsolved Mystery story, which I referenced to already, by 1995. Around the height of just before the 50th anniversary, or 2 years before the 50th anniversary I should say, the Fox television network aired a special called Alien Autopsy, Fact or Fiction. Now, of course, it was hosted by ironically, Jonathan Frakes from Star Trek The Next Generation, hosted this show. And I'm sure he got the job hosting the show Beyond Belief, Fact or Fiction because he hosted this show. But they showed footage of a supposedly alien autopsy. Now, I think also the autopsy footage, I think, is also on YouTube. Well, I know one of the episode versions of it because that special aired twice, and the second special they aired extra footage of the autopsy video. But the autopsy video is not very long. It's about maybe like 20 minutes total, or just under 20 minutes. But they were separate, but the special itself was maybe 45 minutes long without the commercials. And so they're talking about if the footage is real or not. And then, of course, years later, about 5-6 years later, Ray Santilli, who was the one who sold this footage to television networks around the globe, finally came out with that the footage was not real. The reason why it was not, he said it was a reenactment of the actual footage. That's what he says. Because he says he had the original footage, but he said it was so degraded he couldn't sell it to anybody because it was too degraded. So what he decided to do was reenact what he saw in the original footage, which I don't think anybody buys that or believes that. But it's known now that unfortunately the alien autopsy film was faked. So I had to believe that there was an actual alien autopsy, but Ray Santilli actually fabricated it on the rumor that there was an alien autopsy because there was a story by Glendennis, who, when they did an updated version of Unsolved Mysteries, because Unsolved Mysteries did a 1-hour special about the mysteries of alien beings, and they did do an update of the Roswell story, and they put in an interview with Glendennis, who was a mortician in Roswell, and he was also one of the founders. I think he might have just passed away since then. He was also one of the founders of the famous UFO museum out there in Roswell. And he said that there was a nurse he knew, and found out later that his story was not believable either. That a nurse said she did help assist in an alien autopsy. So I think because of that, Ray Santilli did this video. Of course, also in 2000, I should also mention that in 2002, this show is on YouTube, called The Roswell Crash, Starting New Evidence, hosted by Brian Gumbel, which aired on the Sci-Fi Channel. It's an hour and a half long, so it's a little long, but it's worth sitting down and watching that. They did, like I mentioned in the other video I did, there was an archaeological dig at the Foster Sheep Ranch, which is the location of the crash, and they did that. And unfortunately, like I said in that video, that the footage wasn't the dirt samples and everything else. That was still to this day, 20 years later, was never tested exactly what in the lab to see exactly what it is. It's still sitting in a bank vault in Roswell, and a safety deposit box. It's still in a safety deposit box to this day. So 20 years later. So you have that show, you have the alien autopsy show, you have Unsolved Mysteries, you have other shows. You also have the Ancient Aliens series. So it's on. It's currently running now on the History Channel. So the Relics of Roswell, which is that was a pretty good episode. That one. You also have the Day After Roswell. You have another Roswell episode for the UFO File series, which debunks what happened in the UFO crash. But of course, the most famous one debunks it. And I'm going to end with this one. and that is the UFO phenomenon. Seeing is Believing, which aired on ABC, hosted by Peter James, and that show is, as far as I know, it's still up on YouTube now. And that's the one where, towards the end of that show, they talked about Roswell, and that was like one of the longest segments on that particular special. And it was one of the last. It was literally the last completed show that Peter Jennings did. The thing was like later on that year or the next year, he passed away from cancer. Smoking will kill you. But Peter Jennings was a smoker and it killed him. He talked about Roswell, calling the crash of Roswell a myth, which we all know that it's not a myth. And I feel it actually happened, but what it actually was that crash, that is what I have to debate. Of course, I should also mention, I forgot to mention this, the UFO Hunters, a show which is on YouTube, which was talked about the Roswell crash as well. It is also very, very good. It's also very informative, and that show you should also check out as well. The UFO Hunters, as a whole, but they did want a show on Roswell. I'm surprised they didn't do that one as the first episode, or sometime during the first season. But I think they did that during the second season of the UFO Hunters. I'm talking about Roswell. But in terms of the Roswell crash, I think it actually did happen. But the question is, what actually was crashed? And it's an interesting debate, an interesting story that surprisingly has lasted now for 75 years. So this weekend, I know it's 4th of July weekend, it's coming up at the time doing this video. So if you ever had the time, if you're not going to the beach or to a fireworks show or whatever, please find the time to watch these shows that I've talked about here. So there's my review of the 75th anniversary of the Roswell crash. Please check on the video. Please click on the video. Please rate it. Please subscribe to my channel. Please forward this video onto your Facebook pages. You can check out all my reviews on my YouTube channel at rallyc.com. So in WDY.com. Homepage and rally reviewer Chris Lee Moore. And please check out all of his videos on his website. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.